Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. As always, you're with Mike.
And you're with Ian as well.
Yes, as we continue rereading the Aubrey Matron books of our favorite author, Patrick O'Brien. Ian, we're back to HMS Surprise. Where are we and what do we have in store today?
Well, last time we were ashore in Mahon with Marigal's help. Jack had taken the captured gunboat into Mahon with his own followers and volunteers from the Lively. They had taken this French house, the former commandant's house, witnessed brutal torture, killed all the soldiers and officers present in an echo of the taking of that gunboat in deadly style earlier on in the book. Stephen, badly injured, had been carried back to the ship, looking for all the world like a tortured corpse. Stephen had said his thank yous to Joan Marigal and parted with this very characteristic farewell. God go with you, and may no new thing arise. Now, Mike, this week, what new things arise? Well, surprise! We have a celebration of a whole bunch of new things arising. We have a chapter full of names. We have the names, of course, of this book. We have the names of a uniquely named parish near Mapes. We have a ship, a dead French agent, a new chief in the Navy, and, Mike, along the way, plenty of tension and plenty of humor as we dig into a nice little scene-setting interlude trying to drive the plot forward for our favorite characters here.
Nice. Oh, yeah. Ian, I'm really looking forward to this. This is, as you say, we've had two really intense chapters here, and to see where we go here. Well, we open with Stephen recovering in a room at the Crown in Portsmouth, and his landlady is talking to Jack, trying to encourage Jack to have the pail, as she thinks more fit for a hearse than a shay, take a posset and eat some goose pie before traveling. Jack says he'll try, but Stephen, as you know, he says to her, is as obstinate as a bee in a bull's foot. Stephen, as Jack predicted, refuses to drink the posset, right? It says, is this another of your damned possets? Am I in a childbed for all love? That I should be plagued, smothered, destroyed with caudle? And Jack tells Stephen that he's brought some Dr. Mead's instant invigorator with iron for him as well. So we got this great scene-setting thing. Stephen, as we'll see all the way through the canon, not a great patient, even though he's a fabulous doctor, and introducing a lot of terminology in that was certainly new for me, a new Aubreyism and a few English things. Can you give us any help here?
Love to. I love the vocabulary here. A posset is a drink of hot milk that's been curdled with beer and flavored with spices. And why you would give that to a sick person, I have no idea.
Right.
A caudle, on the other hand, is a hot drink. It occurs in many different guises in British cuisine, all the way from the Middle Ages up until Victorian times. Caudle was something thick and sweet and seen as somehow suitable and sustaining for invalids and also for new mothers. A kind of, high-calorie comfort drink, I'm guessing. And we have this really great Aubreyism, as obstinate as a bee in a bull's foot. It's not listed in any of the kind of compendia of Aubreyisms that we know about on the internet, but there is a reference in a 19th century book of Scottish proverbs, and by the way, I think Irish and English ones exist along the same lines. He doesna ken a bee frae a bull's foot. He doesn't know a bee from a bull's foot. This might have originated with a slightly different comparison. He doesn't know beef from a bull's foot. But it's a saying that says this person's extremely ignorant. And of course, in the Aubreyism here, it's been mixed up with obstinate as a mule. So we get as obstinate as a bee in a bull's foot. Pleasing nonsense and an Aubreyism right and proper.
Right. And one, by the way, that's not listed on hmssurprise.org's list of Aubreyisms. So, hey, as I think we said that the first time we went through, we went, we've discovered one that they forgot to list.
You heard it here first.
That's right.
So Killick and Jack bundle the complaining, moaning, grousing Stephen into his greatcoat. They carry him downstairs by his elbows and pack him into this chase. It's stiflingly warm. He's covered with rugs and sheepskins. There's straw underfoot, and Stephen is moaning about this the whole time. And just as Jack is about to get into the chase to join him, a tipstaff touches Jack with his staff. That's the signal to say you're irrevocably taken now, you're under arrest, and commands Jack to come with him and with his burly reinforcements, all in the name of the law, a judgment summons for debt, it turns out. Not his whole great big £11,000 debt, but a smaller debt nonetheless. And Jack realizes that he's going to have to go along with him. He says, Stephen, contact Fanshawe, the prize agent. Wait for me to write you a letter at the Grapes. Meanwhile, Killick goes and gets Jack's bag, and Jack sends Bonden along with Stephen. Stephen, for all he's still recovering, has the presence of mind to ask which sponging house, which kind of debtor's prison. And the tipstaff says, Bolters, Vulture Lane, every luxury, every consideration, all conveniences. Which is, besides being funny, I suspect it's true. I think he would have been hoping to get a generous tip from Jack in return for being made comfortable. Maybe O'Brien was having a joke with the name. Maybe the tipstaff was having a joke with the name. Let's see.
Yeah, Vulture Lane. Well, we join Sir Joseph, who's greeting Stephen. He calls him my dear matron. And he's in Stephen's room in the Grape. So Stephen's been transported along here, and he's expressing his shock at Stephen's condition. And Stephen's saying, no, they just look bad, superficial sequelae, no essential lesion, so leave it to Stephen to give us this medical reason why he's really just fine. But he thanks Sir Joseph for coming to see him at the Grapes, since despite Stephen protesting that he's just fine, he can't walk and he can't go up and down stairs. Stephen complains that, like at the Crown with the proprietor, with Jack, everyone wants to tell him, a medical man, how he should care for himself. And he says, I'm not telling them how to run their inn or sail a ship. And, he finally expresses how he's really feeling. Nostrums from the fairground, quack, old wives' remedies, bah. If rage could reunite my sinews, I should be as compact as a lithosperm. And, I think both you and I tried to find out compact as a lithosperm. It's a very cute plant, lots of different plants, lots of medical uses, but not quite sure how that bounds up your rage in a very small thing here. But no. Sir Joseph was just about to suggest that Stephen should take the waters at Bath, but hearing how Stephen's reacting to those kinds of suggestions, he asks about Captain Aubrey instead. He calls him your friend, and he says how grateful he is for your friend's heroic stroke, meaning, rescuing Stephen. He says the more he reflects on it, the more he honors him. So Sir Joseph is like, okay, boy, I think he's really trying to say, God, I'm so glad you're alive. I'm so glad you're here. And I'm doing that by way of, honoring your friend, who we know as Jack Aubrey, for rescuing Stephen.
Yeah. And it's funny, I keep having to remind myself that in these early stages of the early novels, Blaine hasn't met Jack at all, has had very little to do with him in person. So he's dealing with him really in his character as the friend of Stephen. Anyhow, Stephen goes along with this honouring of Jack's performance in Mahon. He says, yes, it was, meaning a great stroke. It appears to me, said Stephen, that these coups can be brought off only by enormous pains, forethought, and preparation, or by taking them on the volley. And for that, a very particular quality is required, a virtue I hardly know how to name. Baraka, say the Moors. He possesses it in a high degree, and what would be criminal temerity in another man is right conduct in him. Yet I left him in a sponging house in Portsmouth. And we get this nice button on the conversation, just these two nouns, amazement, concern. This writing's great, Mike. I love this, and the characterization just of Joseph Blaine's response here with amazement and concern. I think it's beautiful. We should dig, though, into this idea of baraka. It sounds like a very manly virtue, but until you and I were making this read-through, I hadn't ever really paid any attention to what baraka might actually be or where it comes from.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we might just say um, that it's a God given spiritual force, but if you dig into it even more, if we go to Steve said the Moors say, and is in Islam this baraka, uh, another word for blessing, is a blessing power, a kind of continuity of spiritual presence and revelation that sort of started with God flows through those who are closest to God. The Quran, the holy book, is charged with Baraka. Muhammad and his descendants are especially endowed with it. And supposedly, these people can transfer this kind of God given virtue to people, to other people. Um, and I think it put me in mind of Stephen saying that Jack has this gift. He can pull off these things both in preparation and planning, or on the volley because of this virtue in himself and how he can, not only himself do this but get other people. As we were talking all through the last several chapters, will anybody follow me? How will they do? How will they behave? And all that stuff here. And I love this, how Jack's baraka, Stephen said, would be considered criminal temerity. In other words, kind of excessive confidence or boldness, audacity in other people. But it's right conduct for him. If you have this, it's kind of what we used to say, it ain't bragging if it's true,
Yeah.
maybe. But Jack doesn't say this. He just does this. And then this idea that says, here is this phenomenal description of Jack and the kind of person he is and all that he's done, for England, for Stephen, for Sir Joseph Blaine, if you will. And he's left there in debtor's prison at the end of this. And I thought, wow. And then, as you say, he is amazement, concern. Wow. Wow. The writing, I love it.
It is really good. And I love that it would be a very traditional cliche thing to say the hero is brave. Like, it's a very mundane thing to say. There's a hero in the story, and guess what? He's brave. Especially when he is male, 19th century, employed in the military. But there's a very particular kind of braveness, and it's just played out here. The complexity of the kind of braveness that's attached to Jack. On the one hand, it's braveness in a particular situation and conjoined with being decisive and being a leader. That's the positive spin on the bravery that we've just had. We also get a reflection on the fact that his bravery is not a complete description of him. It doesn't mean that he's just virtuous with no comebacks. He's an idiot in many respects, and in other contexts on shore. As Stephen says, his virtue, that's Jack's virtue, only seems to apply when he's at sea or he's in his maritime character. He'd been arrested here for this debt of £700. Neither Jack nor Stephen had thought that his creditors would know that he was not going to get Spanish gold as a prize, since there'd been no official announcement. And Stephen concludes by saying that he doesn't want to burden Joseph with his personal worries. And if we kind of read between the lines a little bit here, Stephen seems to be saying, I've been tortured. My friend is in jail despite his incredible actions in taking the treasure ship. And by the way, in rescuing what you, Sir Joseph, have already described as one of England's most valuable agents. All of this because of leaks in the Admiralty. And this is why Stephen kind of characterizes himself as burdening Sir Joseph a little bit. And Sir Joseph says, well, I hope that you and I will always be able to speak as friends, and I'm your friend, and I care for you apart from any official considerations. So to say what's on your mind. So here goes Stephen laying it out now for Sir Joseph. Jack has not received the ex gratia payment. His prize agent won't make an advance on it. So this is just going to be a small number of 100 or a few £1,000s. If Jack isn't out of the sponging house before the rest of his creditors find out that he's incarcerated, that's to say the creditors for the big, £11,000 debt, he'll never get out and he'll be in debtor's prison indefinitely. And thankfully, so Joseph in the previous chapter had said, well, I don't think I can help. At least this is now a help of a scale that Sir Joseph thinks he perhaps can give. He says, I'll get the correct word in the correct ear of the Admiralty. I'll get this ex gratia payment expedited, and meanwhile have somebody have a word with Fanshawe to say the Admiralty is going to be good for this payment that's due to be made to Jack, and maybe that's going to help get him released. And it's funny, again, we're at the beginning of the story, and the trust between Stephen and Sir Joseph Blaine is still building. It's taken a particular sort of effort for Stephen to lay things out this clearly in front of Sir Joseph, and a particular effort to get this concession, even though it's not life-saving for Jack, it's still going to be important, I think.
It's like you were saying too, Ian. I find myself having to kind of reset my mind because I've now built up, as many of our readers have, this long time relationship between Sir Joseph Blaine and Stephen and Jack. For people who've read through, for people who are new to the canon, we got to remind ourselves, like you said, Sir Joseph does not know Jack, as he said to the Admiralty board earlier in this book. I've never met the man. I'm not doing anything for him. I'm just doing what's best for the Navy. And I love how, reminding myself, we're still early on. So like this description of Jack by Stephen is deepening our insight into him. We're going to get continued insight into Sir Joseph's character here, and everybody else, Killick as well. I mean, everybody in this kind of little chapter, I was amazed at how many times we're really peeling the onion on people's character and building this so very early that I forget when, this has kind of become part of the sinew of my being, these folks. But gosh, how that was built up by O'Brien so masterfully. Well, continue on, example is there's this funny scene of Sir Joseph. He's sitting there in Stephen's room at the Grapes. It's way too hot, but he doesn't want to admit it. Stephen's asking him, would you like something? Should I open a window? And Sir Joseph is finally like, well, yeah, maybe a little window cracking. Stephen asks Bondin to open the window. Bondin's like, I don't know. There's going to be a draft. I'm not so sure that'd be good for you. Stephen's kind of cracking about, you see, Sir Joseph, you give an order. Nobody even follows your orders anymore. Bondin's like, okay, I got to do this. So he cracks the window just a little bit, dumps a full bucket of coal on the fire to make up for the cool that might come in. and this thing is just, going on and on and on, because Jack, like Killick and Bondin earlier, are all convinced that Stephen has to be in this stifling heat to get better, or he'll die. He'll die from the chill here. But Stephen does admit to Sir Joseph that he loves the heat. And he tells Joseph that he plans to travel to Bath to wallow in their warm and sulphurous waters. And Sir Joseph says that that's the very thing he was going to recommend. We were told earlier when he first came in, he was about to say this to Stephen, but then heard about Stephen being so upset about everybody telling him what to do. And he thinks to himself, I was about to say this to you if you had not looked so very savage, explosive, obstinate, and cantankerous. But what he says is, having thought that, if it had been my place to advise you. So again, I love this Sir Joseph Stephen moment, and I love the way O'Brien expresses these things of what you say, what's going on in your mind.
And we've got a couple of lovely things that we're going to keep coming back to here. In the whole canon, we're going to keep coming back to Stephen is irascible but very articulate when he's being cared for by somebody else. Like this, he's a grumpy patient, but he's in a bizarre way, he's at his best when he's a grumpy patient, because he can really serve everybody out. And we're getting that. Sir Joseph is getting that. We've already seen a bit of it in the chapter so far. We've also had an interesting thing to call a plan. Stephen values heat for his convalescence. Temperature is going to be important to him. Stick something in that. We might need to come back to that in this book here. And then, having just taken notice of those two things, let's get back into the story here, because another thing we're going to get about Stephen is his ability to put people down with well-chosen words. By the way, all of this to me signaling there's nothing at all wrong with Stephen, because he can absolutely give it out with the best of them. Here he goes now, talking initially about Jack Aubrey, and in consequence about the wedding engagement to Sophie. So Joseph had seen the engagement announcement in the Times and understood, he says, that Miss Williams should be a very considerable heiress. So she is, says Stephen, except that the matter is in her mother's hands. And here comes everybody's favorite insult line from Stephen Maturin. The mother, he says, being the most unromantic beast that ever urged its squat, thick bulk across the face of the protesting earth. Oh, I'm going to say it one more time. The most unromantic beast that ever urged its squat, thick bulk across the face of the protesting earth. Amen.
I can't believe we didn't have it on one of our coffee mugs.
Absolutely. I can't believe that Stephen wasn't a revivalist preacher someplace at some point.
Right.
Say it, brother. Anyway, Jack, Stephen goes on to explain, is a romantic. And probably not the word that we would all use to describe Jack Aubrey, but it's not a bad characterization of him being associated with, ideas and intriguing possibility and big ideas and big themes. It's true. Therefore, being a romantic, Jack thinks fortune hunters are scrubs. And by the way, he's a pitiful liar himself. When he had told Jack that the Spanish treasure was not a prize and that therefore Jack was a pauper again, Jack, here's the terrible liar bit, had pretended that he'd known it for a great while and said he didn't mind. And presumably also sparing his friend. God bless him. Meanwhile, then, Stephen believes that Jack had actually written to Sophia immediately upon getting the news and had released her from the engagement. And he explains to Sir Joseph that telling Jack this news and being in this conversation was more painful to him than his interrogation, which is a really big thing. Apart from the fact, he says, that the interrogation itself, though physically painful, was emotionally painful because it was carried out by the French, by the nation that I love best. And they get into talking about the difference between the iniquities of individual people and individual governments on the one hand versus the virtues of a whole nation and a whole national character. So Joseph says, apart from the French rulers, politicians, revolutions, and infatuation with Bonaparte, what civilized man doesn't love the French best? Which is kind of a backward way of doing the John Cleese, you've got to really hate the Romans line from Monty Python and A Life of Brian. Anyhow, I digress. Stephen says the men who had interrogated him were from the ancient regime, the Ancien regime, so not new revolutionary men. So there's corruption and evil to be found in even the most well-ordered societies, including France.
Well, Stephen goes on to say that Jack made short work of the interrogators. And then, coming back to his point about Jack being romantic, he says, like the romantic that he is, Jack tossed his highly valued sword into the sea. And Stephen sums this up for Sir Joseph, says, then again, he loves to make war. No man more eager in the article of battle. But afterwards, it is as though he did not feel that war consisted of killing your opponents. There's a contradiction here. Yeah. And I think for us, in that last chapter, a marked contrast between the French officers who tortured Stephen and Jack as this officer, and Christy Pallier and others we found, kind of exactly what you're pointing out, Ian, kind of the idea of the old France, the virtues of France. Well, wait a minute. These were some of these same people doing this. Wow. Well, O'Brien then goes on to provide more fascinating insight into our characters while actually moving the plot along pretty quickly here in just little ways here. Sir Joseph changes the subject and he says he's delighted Stephen is going to Bath. And O'Brien explains why, why we just had this big revelation about Jack's character and this poignant moment. But all of a sudden, Sir Joseph is back on to going to Bath. And O'Brien says that's because, as he writes, Sir Joseph is much more interested in, quote, the restoration of his friend's health than the conflicts within the heart of a frigate captain he had never met. So, Ian, back to your point again, emphasizing for us, remember, Sir Joseph does not know Jack Aubrey, and he's worried about Stephen, not worried about Jack Aubrey here. And then O'Brien adds this interesting piece about Sir Joseph. He says, although in ordinary relationships, the chief of naval intelligence more nearly resembled an iceberg than a human being, he had a real affection, a real warmth of affection for Matron. I am delighted because you will meet my successor there. So this is Sir Joseph saying to Stephen, I'm so glad you're going to Bath. I'm so glad you're going to get better. and you'll meet my successor. And I'm going, I can see
Hold
from
on a
this,
minute.
yeah, wait, what? Sir Joseph is retiring? What the heck? No, 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 no. We can't do that. What? He's leaving here. So, Ian, can you tell us a little bit more? Sir Joseph retiring, and where's he retiring to? A place that's a little bit new to me, and I think
Yeah.
right next to you.
He's retiring to spend more time with his beetles at his little place in the Fens. So, for those of you who don't know, let's explain what the Fens are. Fens are areas of low-lying flat land in the east of England. This means places like parts of Cambridgeshire, parts of Norfolk, and parts of Lincolnshire that was originally historically marshy wetland, was drained in modern times for agriculture. And the Fens are famous for being flat and rural, perhaps unfairly for being socially backward. Most of the World War II bomber bases that Americans know about are in the Fens. Most of the Cold War era air bases in England are in the Fens because it's flat and there's plenty of space. I think that the reason that Blaine is described as going to the Fens is that there's a Joseph Banks parallel, as there is with lots of the rest of the character of Sir Joseph Blaine. The naturalist Joseph Banks was born into the landed gentry of South Lincolnshire in an area that could certainly be called Fenland. Interestingly, Sir Isaac Newton was also a Lincolnshire chap. I don't know whether his home was in the Fens or not, but it certainly seems like flat landscapes and long winter evenings and open skies are good breeding grounds for scientific curiosity. So Joseph is off to the Fens. I mean, that sounds like isolation to anybody else. So Joseph has some regrets and says, well, I'll still look in London from time to time, but he says, I'm leaving the place in good hands with a gentleman that you've already met, a Mr. Waring. And he describes him as being the man who had taken Stephen's confidential report down as dictation. And he's delighted when Stephen says, I had no idea who this guy was, which suggests that Waring is able to be the kind of unassuming, grey, non-memorable, sub-fusk kind of guy that you need to be when you're in the world of intelligence. So, Stephen, who's a little bit cross to be taken aback with the news, says, you astonish me. I am amazed. But then he starts to smile as he realizes just how well fitted the character of Mr. Waring would be for this job. He remembers him now. He says, oh, yes, he was efficient. He worked without fuss. Questions were immediately to the point. He never gave anything away. No special knowledge, no interest. In no way a show off. In every way, like a dull and respectable civil servant. And now Stephen is really warming to the idea of Waring as Sir Joseph's successor. Sir Joseph says he is a professional. The person who dealt with the late Monsieur de la Tapeterie, that's the French agent who was named as having been perhaps associated with blowing Stephen's cover in the previous chapter. Blaine goes on and says, Stephen had told Waring he had something to give directly to Blaine, and Stephen hands it over now. It's a report that he took from the interrogation just before the Catalan independent folks had burned it. Stephen says, this is a present for you for your retirement. It comes to you by right since you, Sir Joseph, are referred to. And he's having a bit of fun now with the fact that Sir Joseph Blaine is mentioned by name in the report. The report, he says, talks about the wicked manifestations of Sir Blaine, all written in French. The report lists the present state, though, of French military intelligence networks in the eastern part of the peninsula, including Gibraltar, which, by the way, is close to where Jack Aubrey has had to be lately. And it gives a list of agents and payments and all kinds of other juicy counterintelligence information. There will be a number of surprises in there for you, says Stephen, including one Judas, one double agent who has been named and exposed. So Joseph says, okay, excuse me, I'm going to step to one side. And he reads the report, commenting along the way. He's very grateful, very excited. He says, I'm going to share the intelligence, but I'm going to keep my copy of this report so I can gloat on it in my leisured ease. So, Stephen, I think in this chapter, Mike, was the first one to use the S word, right? Stephen's just mentioned a surprise. And so Joseph, who thinks he's being very artful, says, well, in the article of exchanging surprises, I think I find myself beaten out of the ring. Ha ha ha. He may or may not be. Let's see how we get on with revealing surprises as the chapter goes on.
Yeah, and I love this continuing names thing, and you're referring to it now, and we've got how Sir Joseph is named in the French report. We had the name as we talked about before about that French
Oh,
agent referring to his
yeah.
tie to homosexuality, and even Waring. I couldn't help but think, wait a minute, it's Waring, but it's spelled Waring. This dull civil servant whose name is Waring in my mind. He's going to war. So Joseph says, yeah, there's going to be an admiral that has the title of this role, but it's really going to be Waring to me. And by the way, Waring is the guy who killed that French agent for you. And I was like, wow, this is, a lot going on in the names here.
Right. I mean, HMS Surprise, even so, is a better title for the novel than HMS Nominative Determinism. So,
Well put. Well put. Well, as O'Brien often does, we just completely change scenery. We're at Mapes, and the postman, Sophie hears the sound of the postman having delivered the letter and runs down from her room to get it before the butler can take it away to her mother. But the butler's already got it. She's threatening with threatening the butler with death, hanging for, messing with the mail. She storms in, demands the letter from her mother, who is very upset by Sophie's tone and reiterates that she's forbidden Sophia, as she says, to correspond with that felon, adding that he's in prison. What's he in prison for? And, Sophia says, very well he's in prison for debt. And her mom says, well, debt's even worse than knocking somebody over the head. It's aggravated felony. Money's much more important than life, right? Which seems to be the way she's handling this whole thing with Jack and Sophie here. Well, Sophie says that, hey, they're engaged now, and she has every right to correspond. And Miss Williams said, no. I had only given my conditional consent, and now that's all over. So this, as far as she's concerned, this engagement is over. She is not going to let Sophia be made victim by the first man who fancies her fortune, and she will not have clandestine correspondence going on in her house, especially after her cousin Diana, has gone into keeping, being in, living in sin with Canning here. And she goes on, she's just battering Sophie about, in her day, no girl would do any of these things, would speak to her mother the way that Sophia spoke to her. So wicked, so undutiful, they would have died of shame. And she continues on.
She does. While she's admonishing Sophie, she opens the letter and reads it aloud. And she says, you brought on my migraine for nothing. This isn't from Jack Aubrey. This is a letter from Dr. Maturin, and Sophia would not have to blush to read it. And Stephen in this letter is saying that he's sending some books that Miss Williams had wanted, along with the Reverend Mr. Hinksey, the new rector of Swiving Monacorum. And besides sounding like a delightful old name for a delightful old English vicarage, this is Patrick O'Brien having fun with names. Swiving Monacorum. The word swiving is important if you're a scholar of Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. You might already know what this means. It's, well, how can I put it? Swiving Monacorum is English plus Latin, which combined together could be translated as fucking of the monks. And I love the name, and it makes us wonder, Mike, was this Patrick O'Brien having fun with everybody in choosing this place name? Was it Stephen having fun inventing the place name, knowing that there's no way Mother Williams would have known what swiving meant? That's enough for us to start chortling with it, I think. Somebody's having some fun here anyway. Stephen, meanwhile, is glad to hear that the Williams family is going to be at Bath so that he can pay his respects. So he's going there for the hot water cure. He hopes that Mrs. Williams is well. And this gets a nice little cluck of admiration from Mother Williams as she's reading this out. Oh, yes, the doctor is so considerate thinking about my sufferings. He'll do, she says. He'll do for Sissy, for Cecilia. And what does a little popery signify, she says? No, never mind if he's Catholic. At least he's not in debtor's prison. And she hopes that everyone will leave Sissy and Dr. Maturin alone together as much as possible in Bath, which is a completely forlorn hope, but it's funny that she hopes that way. Stephen says further in a letter that he'll be in Bath alone since Captain Aubrey is detained in Portsmouth, which probably gets a bit of a ha of triumph from Mrs. Williams here. She says Maturin has the good sense to no longer associate with Captain Aubrey, and I can just picture her there standing, arms folded, thinking, well, Maturin is in and Aubrey's out and my girls are going to be okay. Little does she know. Mike, we've had quite a lot set up in this first half of the chapter here. Besides all the swiving and the names and the news from Sir Joseph Blaine, perhaps we should just take a step back and grab ourselves a little refreshment and come back to the episode after a bit of a break.
Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying yourself like Stephen is. He's boiling himself to relaxation at the King's Bath, and Bondin is running around in canvas drawers, helping Stephen walk through the crowd to get in and out of the baths. Sir Joseph and Mr. Waring have been watching Stephen and note that he's getting better, that he'd walked a mile the other day. They're taking note of his progress kind of secretly a little bit. And Waring says that Dr. Maturin must have uncommon strength of will and constitution, having seen Stephen's body and, now that he's getting up and down in these baths. And Sir Joseph confirms that, in fact, he has. They talk about Stephen as they go to visit him. They're kind of waiting till he gets home to go pay an actual social call on him here. And Sir Joseph fills Waring in on Stephen's background, saying he's a perfect Quixote. By Don Quixote meaning that he's a romantic visionary, kind of an unworldly idealist here. That he's always worked for Catalan independence. He was a supporter of the French Revolution until '93. He was a United Irishman up until the Rising. And Sir Joseph sums it up saying he's forever supporting causes, heart and soul, blood and purse, from which he derives no personal benefit. So, and the same way he's going after Napoleon with England here and taking not a penny for it. He says that at one time, they worried about him a little bit because he was so chaste that some, particularly some of the Admiralty members, were uneasy about him. But then there was a liaison with a woman of a very good family that ended unhappily and set their minds at rest. So very nice exposition, a fascinating insight into how in the world Stephen and the Admiralty got hooked up, how they saw him, and all of that. And a little reminder to us, like we needed one, of Stephen and Diana here.
Yeah.
But they arrive to see Stephen after their long walk, and they find him when they're escorted into his room being tended by a beautiful woman. They were told he has company, but they're thinking, and this young lady is far too beautiful to be described as company and to be alone in a gentleman's bedroom. Stephen introduces them to Miss Williams, but I think they're still so blown away they're not really paying attention. And O'Brien says the two of them are filled with a new respect for Dr. Maturin of a different kind. Sophie says, I can't stay. I've got to attend to my mother. But then she uncovers this basket she has with her, and she gets out Stephen's doses and pills and everything, and she watches him with a firm benevolence, O'Brien says, until everything goes down, and then she leaves.
It's a lovely moment. This idea that the men there look up to Stephen, thinking he's some kind of dark horse for having a good-looking woman in his bedroom. Anyway, when Sophie finally leaves, Sir Joseph, who can't resist a bit of sort of nudge humor here, said, well, I'd be happy to have my old cramps redoubled if I was going to be dosed by a hand like that. And Stephen's having none of this, shuts them down. State your pleasure, he says to these two smirking men who are in the room here. Sir Joseph says, with a little bit more seriousness, with the greatest respect to Miss, he says, he's never had so much pleasure in the sight of a young lady, such grace, freshness, and colour. Very nice. A very adroit compliment to Sophie. She's not wrong. Stephen says, well, if you think that she's pretty now, you should see her when she's in looks. You should see her when Jack Aubrey's in town. And now the penny drops. Sir Joseph says, that's the captain's betrothed. That explains everything. I like that. That explains how come you're talking to her, how come you're talking to her and she's so good looking, and how come she's in your room and that's in no way a scandal or an inappropriate thing. It also explains why Jack Aubrey is so keen, he thinks, to get his financial affairs back in order and to complete the engagement. How are you doing? He asks Stephen. You seem somewhat recovered. Could it be, asks Sir Joseph, that a hot climate would recover you completely? And Stephen talks about the great physical process he's making. He's planning. Stephen's sign of well-being is that he's up to doing some more grisly anatomy jobs. He's planning to dissect an aged male pauper with a Dr. Trotter this afternoon and intends to be back in town in a week. As far as he is concerned, he is a salamander, a lizard that likes to bake in the sun. Then, in that case, I shall have no scruple in taking my revenge, says Sir Joseph. I believe I shall surprise you as much as you surprised me in London. There's many a true word spoken in jest. And Mike, it's funny, I haven't heard this bit with Tull reading aloud. Does he lean on the surprise in this sentence, or does it let it brew?
I'm trying to remember. Ian, I got to go back now. I probably listened to this 5 times this week. I'm thinking, wait a minute, does he? Because I was, just like, oh yeah, right. To the point of counting the number of surprise, the use of the word surprise there are in this chapter and leading up to it. But yeah, I love this. Love that line. Well, Sir Joseph goes on to explain to Stephen that when a chief retires in the Admiralty, there are certain traditional privileges to honor that retirement. And he proposes to use his privilege upon his retirement here to assign Captain Aubrey and Dr. Matron to a frigate fitting out in Plymouth that's set to take the British envoy, Mr. Stanhope, to Kampong. And he says, he's going to do it despite the fact that it's already been promised to 3 other captains. He gets to have the final disposition of this now. He says this will rehabilitate your cover as a purely scientific character. And he's, asking Waring, does he agree? And Waring says, absolutely, this will do it. And he hopes that it will also restore Stephen's health because it's going to a very tropical climate here. He says, also, I believe it will rescue your friend from the dangers that you told me about. So he's thinking, okay, this is going to get Stephen restored. It's going to get Jack away from the debtors. It's going to put Jack back on a ship, back at sea, out of touch, and back having another chance at his naval career being kind of rehabilitated more here. It's been great. He's just too far down the list. But he says the only problem is that after a false start and a long delay and the discovery of some badly needed repairs, this ship must now sail within the week. And during this long time, the envoy has lost his Oriental secretary, his cook, his valet, and a prize bull that he was to take to the Sultan of Kampong. And he kind of goes on, the ship lost most of her active officers and a large proportion of her men. Well, Stephen says that he and Captain Aubrey, who, by the way, was just released from the sponging house right after, Fanshawe came over and made good and got out just before the rest of the creditors arrived. He and Captain Aubrey, who is currently staying underground at the Grapes, can join the ship this week. All right. And we're still waiting.
Yeah. So it turns out that something may be about to turn out right after all. After Stephen's guests have gone through the details and then left, he asks Bondon to write a letter that he's going to dictate. And this is a very touching moment. I really feel for Bondon. I really feel for his kind of candor, but the kind of slight tone of humiliation for Bondon here, because he has to admit that he can't write. Well, says Stephen, we'll teach you that on the ship. And so, by the way, we've got some really interesting characterization building in this book for both Killick and for Bondon, both of whom were around. Bondon especially in Post Captain, but I like the fact that they're going to be going someplace and we're going to get to know them and their inner lives a bit more closely. He has Bondon then go with a verbal message to go and ask if Miss Williams can join him and to have Mr. Pullings come and see him when he has a minute. And I love his very indirect Suggestion of haste. You may run, Bondon, if you choose. There is not a moment to be lost. And off goes Bondon. After a long pause, Stephen hears the front door again. He's surprised because the Keiths, who own this particular place, and all but one of their servants are away. And who comes up the stairs but Sophia and Cecilia? They walk into the room with Bondon winking and jerking his thumb behind their heads. Lord, Dr. Maturin, cried Cecilia, you are abed, I declare. Why, I am in a gentleman's bedroom at last. That is to say, I don't mean at last at all, but how are you? Cecilia, if only your mother could hear you.
Right.
And they, it turns out, had bumped into Bondon as they were going out. And there's a thundering knock at the door. Bondon vanishes, and Stephen hears a big booming voice talking about the oakum-topped piece. And since oakum is a fiber that you make by untwisting rope, he's clearly talking about Cecilia's teased out and frizzy yellow hair. The author of this remark is none other than our good friend Thomas Pullings, who now appears at the bedroom door. This is starting to feel a little bit like a farce, in a sort of London stage play, but we'll go with it. They had all met already at Jack and Stephen's ball at Melbury Lodge, so they are acquainted. So now Stephen sends Pullings off to show Cecilia Lord Keith's art collection. This is just about as cheesy as saying, why don't you take the girl off and show her your etchings? He's like, take her out, spend a great deal of time talking about Lord Keith's art collection in considerable detail and a great many pieces, including the new Titian. Now, Keith, we already know, is wealthy and collects art. We heard about that in Post Captain. Titian, yeah, you've got to wonder, Mike, is this going to be prudish Catholic Titian or classic mythological Titian? I guess from the fact that he was interested in repentant Magdalens back in the previous book, then maybe it's the biblical kind rather than the classical kind. But we will never know. Anyhow, Stephen says to Pullings, there's a battle scene about the glorious 1st of June, this famous battle in the Revolutionary War, claimed as a victory by both the French and the British fleets, also known as the Fourth Battle of Ushant. Anyway, it's a talking point for many, many naval people, especially in England, and it's the one thing that Pullings, like every other naval officer, can be counted upon to be very boring and particular about. So this is a great example of where Pullings can go and occupy Cecilia so that Stephen can sit down and coordinate here with Sophie.
So, in fact, that's exactly what happens. In that, as soon as they're out of sight, going to look at whichever Titian this is, if we kind of go back to that original viewing, is it the penitent or the unrepentant Magdalene that he's showing them? Stephen starts to dictate to Sophie, and I love the way again O'Brien uses the words. Dear Jack, he says, we have a ship, surprise, for the East Indies, and must join at Plymouth instantly. And then he says, ha, what will he say to that? And there's a dash, and then O'Brien writes, surprise was what he said, in a voice that made the windows of the Grapes one pair front tremble. In the bar, Mrs. Broad dropped a glass. The captain's had a surprise, she said, glazing placidly at the pieces. I hope it is a pleasant one, said Nancy, picking them up. Such a pretty gentleman. So this, that we've had this surprise ringing back and forth throughout the chapter so artfully. And then here it is in the way O'Brien writes this, Jack, I wonder what he'll say with that. Surprise, surprise, surprise. And now we have them going back and forth. What's actually happening with Jack? What's happening with Stephen dictating with Sophie? I love the way this all gets set up here.
So now we jump ahead to the moment where Jack is together with Pullings, and Jack tries to break the news to Pullings that the doctor has found them a ship. He gets Killick to go and book inside seats on the Plymouth Mail. He says, get all my sea luggage together. Killick says, you can't travel by a mail coach, nor even a chaise, not with bums lining the shore. Bums, he means debt collectors. And we heard before that they kind of wish they could pull what they call the hearse trick, and Killick sees his moment here. I'm going to arrange a genteel 4-horse hearse, he says. And we get another reference again to the name of the ship. Surprise, cried Jack again. And now we get some backstory. I have not set foot in her since I was a midshipman. He saw her plain, lying there a cable's length from him, in the brilliant sunshine of English harbour, a trim, beautiful little 8 and 20. And I'm almost getting kind of, harps and angelic music as we're transported back into Jack's reverie of remembering the beautiful surprise at anchor in the West Indies. Mike, this is such an important moment, and the surprise is going to be such an important character that perhaps we should give our good friend Russell Crowe the chance to complete the quote. Here he comes with a little bit of introduction from Paul Bettany.
The surprise is a somewhat aged man of war. Am I not correct?
Would you call me an aged man of war, Doctor? The surprise is not old. No one would call her old. She's a bluff bow, lovely lines. She's a fine seabird. Weatherly, stiff, and fast. Very fast if she's well handled.
So there we have it. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's that surprise. Just in case you weren't sure with the title of the book and the dust jacket and all of the reference to the surprise from Sir Joseph, it's that surprise. Now, this was a ship of Jack's well-remembered youth. He had spent hours as a midshipman, banished to the masthead, reading. He had carved his initials there, which, by the way, we also see in the Russell Crowe movie. He wonders if the initials are still to be seen. He also remembers that she's old, so Paul Bettany was half in the right of it and requires a bit of nursing. But he dismisses also the ungrateful thought that's building in his head that the Indian Ocean has maybe already been swept clean of prizes, because he has to remember as well that besides being old, the surprise is fast. So, Mike, this is a great juncture for Jack Aubrey. Maybe everything is going to start to turn out well here, and all he needs now is a crew and some officers.
Yeah, I'm getting this, kind of Blues Brothers feeling of getting the band back together. We got Bondin, Killick, Pullings here. Jack asked Pullings if he's coming, if Mrs. Pullings will object. And Pullings says, well, certainly he's coming. Mrs. Pullings will, as he says, pipe her eye, but then quickly brighten up and be glad to see him back at the end of the commission. Perhaps, he says, and O'Brien writes, more pleased than she is now. That is, with him all underfoot. And Pullings tells Jack, it ain't like aboard a ship, sir, the marriage state. And there's kind of a pause. Ain't it, Pullings? Said Jack, looking at him wistfully. And I can just see Jack, with this wistful look, this longing. And I thought to myself, is he longing to be married? Is he longing to be at sea? I suspect he's longing for all of the above. And Ian, you caught this. I actually was typing our notes up for this, and I had said, wiping, she might wipe her eye. And you said, Mike, go back and check that. It's pipe her eye. And I thought, pipe her eye? What is that?
Well, it's funny. We just kind of stumbled over it as a very, very period authentic phrase meaning to cry. It's an archaic, very idiomatic phrase that means to weep. And it turns out that the verb pipe in this case actually refers to naval practice. It refers to a bosun's pipe, which calls people to their duty. So, for example, Thomas Hood's Faithless Sally Brown includes the line, he first began to eye his pipe and then to pipe his eye. So, to pipe your eye means to weep. So, poor old Jack and Pullings reflecting on what it's like to be in the marriage state. And Pullings is perhaps giving Jack a little bit of a word to the wise as to what might await him. Now, Mike, we had that great big switch of perspective over to Jack and the grapes, and it's a surprise. We go back now to the original scenario, which is Stephen sitting in Lord Keith's bedroom here, drafting and dictating this note. He, writing now in the note once more, tells Jack that the surprise and the necessary Admiralty papers are all ready. They're all up to date. And he suggests a rendezvous point at 4 a.m. on the morning of the 3rd as they each head to Plymouth. So this is a land rendezvous on the roads in the kind of western counties of England here. That will mean that Jack can go aboard on a Sunday when he won't be able to be arrested for debt. Stephen will wait for him at this particular crossroads in a chase. If they miss each other, he says, he and Bondon will see Jack at the Blue Posts, which is a pub, presumably in Plymouth. He closes the letter with a little account of exactly what he's heard about the surprise. She is a frigate, it appears, of the smaller kind. She is short of officers, men, and, unless Sir Joseph spoke in jocular hyperbole, of a bottom. In haste. And then comes the sign-off. And we never really find out what Sir Joseph meant by she doesn't have a bottom. I don't think she's been completely stripped of copper, but there's been some mysterious, shipwrightery thing that needed to get put right. And neither Stephen nor Sir Joseph can adequately explain what it is.
Well, Stephen tells Sophie to hurry, hurry up, finish writing this letter so I can send it to Jack. So we can see we're jumping back and forth in time here. So we're back, like you had said, Sophie, taking the dictation. But, Stephen says, let me see it. And Sophie says, nope. And she folds it up and won't show it to him. And he narrows his eyes and says, well, you wrote more than I told you to. And, she's not saying anything, but he realized it. He said, well, did you at least get the rendezvous details right? And she recites them from memory. And Stephen's like, yep, that's right. And she says, well, I said that I'll be there as well. So she's planning to go along on this trip and have a chance to see Jack again. She says to Stephen, I'm going to slip out of my window. I will meet you at the corner and you can pick me up and take me with you. Now, he asks how she'll get back. And then he says, you're going to be so hopelessly compromised if somebody sees you walking about Bath alone at dawn. And O'Brien writes, so much the better, said Sophie. Then I shall have no reputation left whatsoever and shall have to be married as soon as possible. Why did I not think of that before? Oh, Stephen, you have beautiful ideas. I just love that as well. This is great. Oh, Stephen, I could have short-circuited all this a long time ago if I just lost my morals early and forced Mama to have me marry off to the captain.
And I love how the closer she gets to being able to actually fulfill her love for Jack, that the less it turns out that what she cared about all along was really important. What? Reputation? My mum? People about town? who cares? I really love that about Sophie, that she's got reserves of courage and a healthy attitude to what other people think of her as well. Anyhow, Stephen agrees, therefore, to meet her on the corner at the ungodly hour of 3:30 in the morning, gives her instructions for dressing warmly. They're going to have to wait for a long time, and the wind will chill her even more. Disappointment coming on top of falling damps, he thinks, will be a bad thing. She needs protection and to be wrapped up. And we jump ahead now to the appointed hour. It's 3:30 in the morning. There's a strong nor'easter howling along the chimney tops of Bath. Sophie tries to sneak out of her house, but the door slams, and she attracts the attention of a group of drunken soldiers who, in O'Brien's words, instantly give tongue. She puts on a firm step. She walks with resolution and purpose towards the corner, but she sees no coach. She hears steps running up behind her and a low cry. And it's Bondon. He takes her around the corner. He takes her into the first of two post-chaises there that have been drawn up, discreetly distanced from the house. And we get an unusual bit of first-person perspective for Sophie here. Her heart is beating so fast that she can hardly speak. And when she can speak, she says that everything looks different at night, as though everyone were dead. The river perfectly black. Which, by the way, is a really chilling echo of all the death imagery that we had in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Stephen says, well, some nights it's sweeter than this. And just to give the lie to that idea, we hear the shriek of a vixen. Enough, says O'Brien, to chill the blood of an apostle. But Sophie is too busy now focusing on Stephen. She's plucking at his garments and straightening up all his blankets and his layers, and she fusses over him and chides him for not dressing warmly enough himself. So, little brother and sister moment there between Stephen and Sophie, and they're about to set off, right?
They are. And Stephen's explaining that, he didn't really need anything else. You don't have a gray coat. I don't need that. He said the body retains its natural heat through its thick outer layer. So no other covering is necessary as long as you're not in the wind, like Poolings is seated up on the coach seat. In a well-constructed carriage, he explains, we are safe. And then O'Brien writes, A reasonably well-constructed carriage, I say. I should never advise you to career over the steppes of Tartary in a tarantass, with your bosom bare to the winds, or covered only with a cotton shift, nor yet a jaunting car. Sophia promised that she would never do so. Uh, so we're back to Tartary, where Sir Joseph said, we'll send you to recover your name back a few chapters ago, and they had laughed about it. Now we're laughing about this here. Tartary and this tarantass, a large four-wheeled open Russian carriage with no springs, mounted on two parallel wooden bars. Quite the jarring open ride here. So we have this here, but we're kind of, it's funny. We just had this thing where Sophie's a little bit in danger, and then it picks up, turns out to be Bondin. Oh, it's all deadly dark at night. The vixen yells, but I'm fixing Stephen's clothes. And we go on, Stephen kind of starting to perhaps give us a little forewarning of what might lie ahead. He had originally told Sophie, as you mentioned, Ian, that you got to dress warmly because you might be disappointed. Jack might not meet us there. And that disappointment on top of the falling dams. So now he continues on.
Yeah. Right, Mike. So here we have now Stephen telling Sophie, he's kind of setting her expectations, that she must make up her mind not to be disappointed if they don't see Jack. And he's clearly, well, objectively, he's thinking, well, there are lots of reasons why Jack might not make it here. This is the real world that we live in. There have been presumably debt collectors and, things happen, so to speak, at sea. But I also think he's making game of her a little bit. Let's just see how this plays out. There are all these accidents, he says, that could befall Jack on the 100 miles of road. The likelihood of him falling off, or his horse flinging him down and breaking its knees, the danger of footpads and highwaymen. He says, but hush, I must not alarm you. So they slow down. Stephen thinks they're near the cross, near the rendezvous point. He looks out into the darkness, and in one pool of light, he can see a horseman. The post boy also sees this horseman, turns around and calls out to the chase behind him. It's Butcher Geoffrey, he says, we must turn around. The boy on the other chase calls back, there's two more of them behind us, terrible great murdering devils. Stephen and Sophie hear a horse riding up fast. Sophie says, Stephen, don't shoot him. And now, tension rising to the boiling point here. Stephen turns around from the open window and says, I have no intention of shooting, but here, the horse is upon them. And here's O'Brien's description of this last moment. It's hot breath steaming in, and a great dark form leaning low over its withers, shutting out the moonlight. The rider says in a civil murmur, I beg your pardon, sir, for troubling you. And Stephen cries, spare me, take all I have, take this woman, but spare me, spare me. We pause. We never get the payoff because Sophie was there ahead of us. She says, I knew all along it was Jack. And of course, she's very glad to see Jack. Stephen and Jack were having a little bit of harmless fun with her. Without specifying what they're going to do exactly, Stephen says to Jack and Sophie, you have half an hour. I don't think that's that's for any personal time. I think they just need to go and have a little talk because this was still the Regency times. And it was 4:00 in the morning. But anyhow, Stephen says that, as Sophie already knows, I think, she needs to be back in her warm bed before cock crow, and he walks over to the other chase to give them a bit of something like privacy. Killick is telling Bondon about how they had departed from London in a hearse with a strong note of pride in having been able to play the hearse stunt, finally at last. With Mr. Pullings for added colour in a mourning coach behind him. I can just picture Pullings with like black silk drapes and stuff. Hilarious. Bums by the score, says Killick, on either side of the road, pulling their hats off and bowing, respectful. I wouldn't have missed it. I wouldn't have missed it. No, not for a bosun's warrant. So, delight with Killick and Bondon there that they've managed to get Jack out with this famous hearse ruse that they so badly wanted to pull off. While Jack and Sophie are continuing their talk and Killick and Bondon are swapping hearse stories, Stephen gets to talk with Pullings about the Indian voyages that he's made and about the ever-present heat, even at night. And remember, we're talking a lot about heat and Stephen in this book. he gives us a strong clue here. He says, if I don't reach a warm climate soon, you can bury me and write, he of mere misery perished away. And by the way, another thing that we're going to get many more times in the canon after this is Pullings being the one who tells people what the weather's like where they're going.
That's right. When Stephen's repeater watch tells him that it's time, he listens and there's no sound from the other chase. And he's kind of looking out. Finally, the door opens and Jack hands Sophia out and cries, "Bonded back to the Paragon and t'other coach with Miss Williams. Come down by the mail. Sophie, my dear, jump in. God bless you." And then we hear from Sophie, "God bless and keep you, Jack. Make Stephen wrap himself in the cloak. And remember, forever and ever, whatever they say, forever and ever and ever." End of chapter 4.
Oh, yeah. Isn't it great? For all it's quite kind of light, it's a really, really clever job that O'Brien's done stringing this chapter together. It could have worked very differently. Stephen was at a really low ebb in the previous chapter, right? He carried out on a hurdle or whatever it was, looking up at the stars, half crippled, half dead. It seemed the torture that he had suffered was real, and we have to have a reason to believe in this chapter that he's making a quick recovery. And O'Brien does that masterfully, but still reminding us that Stephen is still convalescent. But his, I don't know what you might call his moral force, his moral fiber is really, really strong. He can see that he's got a long recovery ahead, and we've been talking about what that's going to take. But Stephen shows really great moral strength, I think, in this chapter. Willpower, you might say, as well as kind of physical healing. And we had strength of other kinds from Stephen earlier, right? In Post Captain, we had his strength as a friend and as a leader in some cases. We had strength in his role as an intelligence agent. And now, even from his bed, Stephen is providing intelligence that he had gathered while he was being tortured. And he's just, he's another kind of hero. We talked about what kind of hero Jack is. And here's another kind of hero that Stephen is, in kind of contrast. Maybe contrast is the wrong word, but kind of holding up a mirror to the mastery that Jack showed in leading the crew of the Lively and in seizing the treasure in Post Captain, and most of all in rescuing Stephen from Mahon. Stephen in this chapter has already started to repay the favor and keep the friendship spinning by rescuing Jack from the debtor's prison, or at least arranging for it, at least for now. And as far as we can tell, from his pressuring of Sir Joseph, has been at least partly responsible for Jack getting the ship that he's got. And what a ship.
Right. Absolutely. And even though Jack is on land where, perhaps as Stephen says, his particular battle and leadership virtues don't seem to apply, I was really impressed about how he looked after Stephen and how calm he was when he was taken, when that tipstaff got him. He still was like, okay, let's get Stephen taken care of. I'll rate you at the grapes. And the way that he's set himself up to hopefully make it to the ship without being taken again. So we don't see the rash, brash Jack kind of, throwing caution to the wind the way he did in Post Captain so often. And another shout out to Killick. Thanks for the hearse, buddy, because Jack was about to go, male coach, no male coach. So it's great, but fascinating chapter, Ian, as you say.
Yeah, and very cleverly made funny. It in the hands of another writer, it could have really rung false to get humor and kind of levity in a chapter immediately after two chapters with so much death and darkness in them. But it's absolutely on point. The humor, the irascibility of Stephen, and the ongoing hijinks of Killick and Bonden, and the goodwill, the kind of warmth of of everybody's connection with Sophie as well. It's really, really lovely. Maybe O'Brien was pointing that out in the way that he constructed the final scenes. We had Sophie walking out of her horse at dawn with the highwaymen appearing, all of this potentially ominous setup, all of this darkness, undercut all the way through with humor and bathos and just like fun at everybody's expense.
Right.
Certainly after all the violence and destruction and corruption of the previous two chapters, for us as readers, I think that was really welcome.
I certainly loved it. It reminded me once again why I love that there's just so much in this, and all done so well, and all so credible and so earned here. And even if we put that humor and the undercut tension aside, now we kind of take stock here. Well, it looks like Jack has a new ship. Looks like Jack and Stephen each have new missions. Stephen has a chance to recover in a warm climate and repair his blown cover. Jack has a reprieve from his debtors. He's still engaged to Sophie, despite Mrs. Williams' protests. But I had to stop back and go, okay, again, it's like, oh, we took the treasure ship. We're all in great shape having taken the treasure ship. Oh, turn the page. What happens? And I'm thinking to myself, but what? Has O'Brien set up anything here? Well, it's an old ship, as Stephen says, if Sir Joseph's right to say without a bottom, it's just been repaired for this long journey to the east. There are no prizes left on the Indian Ocean. And then I thought, but wait, India, hold on. Anybody we know who's in India at the moment? Even if they're going to Kampong, where might a British ship stop on a journey like this? And then I think, oh, this is a great setup. And I think, well, wait, no. O'Brien never just continues on an uninterrupted course. What in the world does he have in store for us next?
Mike, I think there's only one way to find out. What do you say to a little bit more Patrick O'Brien?
With all my heart.
And there's a really funny O'Brien. Sorry, hang on, I'm going to sneeze.
Bless you.
Me. I didn't get to the mute button in time. Sorry, Sam. I hope I haven't blown your speakers out.
There we go. There's one.